Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out live onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads, living room television. My name is Martin. I'm the Pervasive Media Studio's creative technologist. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the studio for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio or for whom this may be the first time you're engaging. For all of you, here's a little bit about what we do. The Pervasive Media Studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding, product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, the University of the West of England, and the University of Bristol. We're a home for early ideas and companies and a meeting place for creative and commercial interests. We have a studio space offering desk space, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, all for free. And we're a safe space for artists to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. So this week's talk is called Far From Paradise, Radically Reimagining Social VR. Studio resident Tessa Ratuszynska will be talking about how virtual reality experiences are designed for an ideal user and the exclusionary repercussions of that choice. They'll also be exploring how social VR can generate new visions of public life, community, and connectedness. There'll be a Q&A at the end with the talk running about 35-40 minutes. If you want to ask questions, just pop them into the chat window over there and I'll pick them out, ask Tessa. Do feel free to post responses or questions as we go. There will be a captioned and recorded version of the talk available here at this link after the talk is finished. Now, brief content warning, this talk will contain some discussions of racism, sexism, ableism, as well as the violence that's associated with those. There'll be some discussion of the recent Black Lives Matter protests, both in America and in Britain. Any of that's likely to be a problem for you, might want to give. You can get news on all of our future talks by following us on @PMStudioUK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter on our website. We've even got like a handy add to your calendar thing there, so you can add it to your digital calendar and you'll get pop-ups. Everything will be reminded to you by wonders of. Now, next week's talk is actually a little different. For the month of September, we're handing over to Watershed's research team, who'll be taking over the lunchtime talks to showcase some of the work that's come out of their collaboration with the university. The first talk in that series is called Data Nature, and it'll be a panel discussion between artist Kathy Hind, designer Pete Quinn Davis, and biologist Matt Baker. They'll be talking about their work through the Southwest Creative Technology Network's data fellowships, looking at data in the natural world and some unconventional approaches to combining the two. At 1 p.m. next Friday, right here, this YouTube. Anyway, that's enough from me. You're all here to watch a talk, so I'd like you all to give a very warm welcome to Tessa Ratuszynska.
Thanks, Martin. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. As we said, my name is Tessa Ratuszynska, and I just wanted to second Martin's introduction and to be a bit more specific and give a bit more content description. So I will be discussing race, gender, and disability from a critically queer perspective. So as social constructs fixed to certain bodies rather than attributes inherent to those bodies themselves. And as part of this, I will mention violence that is created by or used to maintain those constructs, including gender-based violence and state violence, including police brutality. I won't show any images relating to these, and I will be showing images of protests in Bristol and the US. I speak as a queer person who doesn't identify as trans, but is gender non-conforming. I'm white. I don't currently identify as disabled. And I understand that I speak on ableism, racism, and anti-Blackness as someone without lived experience. And the aim of this talk is really to share a research project looking at how these issues interact with the politics of space and embodiment in VR. And I welcome feedback and recommendations for further reading and any possibilities of collaboration as well with spaces, activists, or individuals. And my contact details will appear at the end. And I'm going to visually describe any images that I specifically refer to in the talk. And this talk, if you prefer kind of written versions of text, this talk will be available as a blog post on the Bristol and Bath Creative R&D blog next week, I believe. And then the URL boxes of this kind of visual motif of windows I'm using here will show the sources of the references the content that I'm discussing, but they're also in the reading list, which is like under the video. So just to like actually begin, who am I? I'm an installation artist and a documentary maker and a producer, and I predominantly work in VR, making VR, and also exhibiting and curating VR. And I'm generally interested in the intersection between documentary, or maybe more broadly nonfiction, and interactive or immersive arts. So where artworks could be said to be nonfiction experiences. So this ranges from work like Olafur Eliasson's kind of nonfiction experiential installations, which explore the qualities of light and perception. So this is an unflattering picture of me inside a yellow light room at his retrospective in the Tate last year, all the way through to kind of a walk-through documentaries, which we most associate with VR. And ultimately, I'm really interested in what it feels like to be inside spaces and what sort of non-fiction concepts these can speak to us about. I'm currently engaged in a practice-based PhD at the University of West Scotland, exploring the kind of transformative power of VR non-fiction. And I'm particularly looking at spaces of masculinity and the performance of masculinity through a kind of decentered or queered lens. So this is a picture of me making VR in a packed out football stadium. I'm from Bristol, and I'm a resident of the Pervasive Media Studio, and I'm also a New Talent Fellow on the Bristol and Bath Creative R&D Expanded Performance Pathfinder. The Creative R&D programme is like a research collaboration between Bristol Unis, Bath Unis, the Watershed, and Southwest creative and tech industries. And the Expanded Performance Pathfinder looks specifically about at how new technologies are going to intervene or change or expand our ideas about performance, audience, togetherness, and liveness. And my research project on this fellowship explores multi-user VR space as potential sites for these new performances and new ways of coming together. And so it's that project that I'm talking about today. So by multi-user VR, I mean kind of the potential for multiple people, either in the same geographic location or different geographic locations, putting on a headset and through an internet connection, all being present together inside a virtual space, like where they can live interact with one another and the space and like maybe the content inside. So this might be used for co-working. This is an image from an architect's company where with two users inside VR, inside an architectural drawing. But it could also be used for socializing, gaming, or more traditional performance like music concerts and theatre. So this is a poster from a Jean-Michel Jarre VR concert that happened during lockdown. And these spaces, which do kind of exist already, have been really widely criticised for being exclusionary and perpetuating harmful behaviours. So this is an image from an article I'm going to be talking about later, which shows a woman getting chased by a man inside a multi-user VR platform, sort of like a public platform. So in my research, I've read and thought a lot about how virtual worlds are made, from the bodies we inhabit when we enter them, to how the space inside them is configured and the rules that govern how we interact with objects and each other inside them. And this project explores what lessons can be learned from existing virtual spaces and from existing real-world spaces in order to imagine multi-user VR spaces which center the safety of users and beyond those, especially those beyond those catered to by mainstream multi-user VR as it exists now. So at the end of this project, I hope to have prototyped a series of multi-user VR spaces built around and for specific communities, built around their needs and how they need to congregate. And in a design activist approach, I'm hoping that just by presenting the variation within these spaces, how they look, but also how they feel and how bodies might move within them, that this will spark ideas about the future of multi-user VR, how it could and should look, and also who could and should be able to experience it. So this talk kind of summarizes the concepts I've encountered during this research, and also situates this project, which actually began before lockdown, within the context of current world events. And so I think a discussion about the potential for how multi-user VR could be configured to be like more equitable is particularly timely and important for two main reasons. So firstly, because obviously, as international pandemic has indicated, there are going to be times where we can't be together in real world space and face-to-face contact isn't possible. And whether that's the ongoing effects of COVID or like imminent ecological collapse, there is a need for online spaces where people can be together. And we can see from like the drastic uptake in apps like Zoom that the kind of traditional text-based interactions or social media interactions just weren't enough to sustain most people at this time, and that there was like a more embodied medium that was needed. But lots of questions have been raised about the long-term psychological and physiological effects of like not experiencing touch and not being able to be physically present with others at this time, and also the limits of video on serving this purpose. So video lag creating ineffective and unproductive communication, and obviously its base and have their bodies represented in real time has become like far more pressing. But even before this, like most iterations of VR hype, including like possibly even just the earliest conceptions of the internet, were built around this idea that in the future, like virtual embodiment in cyberspace is where it's going to be. So this is an image from the original Tron movie. In fact, the most recent like VR boom was in no small part driven by the fact that Oculus, the headset technology, was bought by Facebook, which is obviously the world's leading social media conglomerate. And this implied to many that multi-user VR was the future of social online interaction. The fact that Facebook deal in personal data and headsets collect some of the most personal data about users is probably a whole talk in itself. I'm just going to drop that in there. But the point is that although it seemed kind of far-fetched that like us all using VR headsets in our homes, or headsets being as ubiquitous a technology as phones and laptops did seem really far-fetched, it doesn't seem as far-fetched now as it did kind of before March. So for these reasons, I think it's really important to interrogate now how these spaces are designed and who they're designed for, and with what users in mind, and also by way of that, who feels safe in these spaces and who doesn't, basically. And secondly, COVID has seen a lot of different debates about access to space and safety of in space entering the wider public consciousness. So I'm not going to lay out a COVID timeline or fully articulate these activist movements because that's a task kind of beyond me and beyond this talk. But I can describe how they came onto my social media, which is how I experienced them, and also their impact like on this project. So first, I kind of became aware, or collectively we became aware, of the voices of disabled artists and disability activists who were already existing in like a pretty dilapidated situation in the UK support system, and that at the beginning of lockdown, when those support systems were taken away, life became much harder. And on top of this, there was a lot of kind of dismissive, harmful, maybe shaming or victim blaming language in the press and coming from government about at-risk people, vulnerable people, that kind of thing. Plus a kind of wide public discussion about how unbearable lockdown was, when actually this is a lived kind of reality for lots of people. And then on top of this, the creative sectors particularly, there was this like move to make cultural space or cultural work available online, which was something that wasn't deemed valuable enough to happen before lockdown. So there was a kind of injustice in this, and also a real injustice in the fact that it wasn't artists who were already working in this way or already consider those things as part of their practice being the ones that were approached by these institutions to consult on how they should approach this. And then following this obviously there were and still are the international activism movements and protests which were responding to the disproportionate violence enacted by state structures on Black bodies following the murder of George Floyd in the US. And also the UK's Black Lives Matter protest coincided with the release of a government report which detailed the massive disparity in the fatalities and exposure to COVID amongst BAME citizens. And further Black Lives Matter protests calling for the arrest of the police officers responsible for the murder of Breonna Taylor in the US, and international Black Trans Lives Matter protests aim to highlight the intersection of racist, anti-Black, misogynist, anti-LGBTQ+, and specifically anti-trans oppression, which culminates in the most exposed violence to violence group in the world being Black women and Black trans women particularly. So this is an image of the massive Black Trans Lives Matters protests in New York. And all this work kind of illustrates that spaces, so cultural space, public space, carceral, like prison spaces, medical space, spaces of community, and in the tragic case of Breonna Taylor, who died in her home, even domestic spaces, are not equally and safely accessed and populated by everyone. And that the harm perpetuated in these spaces often isn't just like the harm of interpersonal prejudice, although that obviously exists, but it's harm created by the state and by structures of power, and also by how those structures of power arrange those spaces, so for who, and how it polices bodies and behavior in those spaces. So this makes the idea of just merely carbon copying versions of like these kind of spaces into virtual worlds really problematic if we want to make those worlds more kind of equitable. And it also illustrates how important it is that communities themselves are the ones consulted and foregrounded when designing a space that centers their safety. So in thinking about a future that looks safer and more egalitarian for Black people and people of color, women and trans women in particular, and disabled people, understanding obviously that those identities aren't mutually exclusive, we're often forced to think within the bounds of existing structures. So that's structures of power, but also obviously like literally buildings, and apply this kind of interventionist approach. A benefit of virtual reality is that it allows us to like speculatively imagine spaces which center the safety and protection of their users, but from the bottom up. So imaginatively abandoning old structures is easier in the first instance when all you have to arrange is like pixels rather than physical bricks and mortar, although obviously you'd hope that those would follow. And I always find this quote by like sometimes attributed to Zizek kind of helpful when thinking about this. So in his Pervert's Guide to Cinema film series, he talks about at the height of CGI in Hollywood in the late 90s, that there was this proliferation of images being made, imagining the end of the world in these fiery interplanetary explosions. And that there was more of these images than there were any other kind of visions of the future. His point being that these powerful technologies of like rendering images are not often turned to imagining new ways of being and living in the world. And sort of my point is that VR can do this, and beyond just imagining them visually, in the context of social VR, they can imagine new embodied social ways of being together in worlds, and perhaps new ways of perceiving altogether. So this is a screenshot of an article where trans filmmaking duo, the Wachowski sisters, recently revealed that their 90s classic about VR, The Matrix, is actually an allegory for trans liberation. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about ideas about embodiment and architecture, coding and interaction, and how these all contribute to who does and doesn't feel comfortable or safe in virtual and real spaces, and as also things to consider when we're designing virtual worlds. So I was going to show a video, but I don't have time, but it's in the description. It's like a super 90s Matrix inspired video about VR. and it's quite a helpful introduction and also quite funny, so I'd recommend watching it. But this kind of 90s style of the presentation itself, I'm, as well as just liking that aesthetic, I'm also using it to kind of talk about VR from a theory point of view. So we used to subscribe, or like Western philosophy used to subscribe to this idea of the Cartesian split, that that the mind and the body are separate. I think, therefore I am. And therefore that the virtual world or virtual reality would be just like plugging the brain into a computer and we'd be free from our bodies. But this isn't really representative of our experience of VR or with just like interfacing with technology at all. And the way we engage with computers, so like through like desktops, with windows, with folders, this is a kind of virtual reality in itself. So we turn the just coded language of a computer into a predominantly spatial interface. So we imagine things are inside our inbox, or we empty the trash, like we use this physical language because we use our body and ideas about space to interface with technology and just the world in general. So this fits the more kind of contemporary understanding of experience, which we call embodied cognition, which just suggests that we think with our bodies and our minds like together. And those things interact with space, and that all these things are interwoven and can't really be pulled apart. And virtual reality is actually a very embodied medium. The illusion of space inside virtual reality is like maintained by the computer receiving like complex information about the movement of the body and then sending equal and opposite information to the sensory organs of the body, and feeding back to our embodied senses. So Jaron Lanier, who's like the godfather of VR, describes it like this: wherever the human body has a sensor, like an eye or an ear, a VR system must present a stimulus to that body part to create an example illusionary world. Unlike prior media devices, every component of a VR must function in tight reflection to the motion of the human body. So he defines VR as a mirror image of a person's sensory and motor organs, or an inversion of a person. And what I'm trying to say here is that basically making VR is not only about making spaces, but it's also about building around bodies. So I'm just going to quickly summarize here some VR research. Which helps us kind of understand what users are experiencing in VR and the potential impact of embodiment in multi-user VR spaces. So firstly, the illusion of body ownership. This is like just the feeling of ownership of a virtual body, even like a pretty rudimentary one inside VR, happens really quickly and profoundly. And that if that virtual body is then threatened, the physical body of the user will react. Essentially, the body you control in VR feels like yours, and what happens to it can have visceral, emotional, and physical implications for the user. This research is by Mel Slater, and I've linked it in the notes. Secondly, the Proteus Effect. This is by Jeremy Badenson and his gang. He has like a really interesting chapter in this book, Experience on Demand, where he talks about the effects of being embodied as other people or in other bodies rather than like as ourselves in VR. And the Proteus Effect relates to the changeability of our behavior based on the perceived attributes of the avatars we embody. So people embodied in avatars that they deem to be attractive tend to act more gregariously in like social VR situations. They stand closer to people, they talk more. And people embodied in taller avatars tend to be more aggressive in kind of negotiation, like simulations. Lots of claims have been made about virtual reality and empathy and how it allows users to take the perspective of another. And that has been shown to work positively in this example, reducing ageist bias by embodying users in an aged avatar of themselves. But he also, well, these experiments seem to depend really highly on their context. So that means the scenario or the space in which the digital experience is set. So he notes this really troubling instance where participants, both black and white, scored higher on an implicit bias test, which tested racial bias, after a VR experience where they embodied a black body in a job interview type scenario. And this outcome is thought to be because the scenario itself triggered negative stereotypes in the users about Black people and work. And virtual reality in general, or these avatars in general, seem to activate and accentuate culturally held stereotypes, both negative and positive, about attributes like height, age, beauty, gender, and race. So although in his book, Bailenson is kind of like neutral about this, to me it's highly troubling. And it certainly indicates that the venues and spaces upon which social VR are modeled are highly significant, as they can significantly increase bias and prejudice held by users and also held against users' avatar presentations. And then this is the most interesting one for me. This is the concept of homuncular flexibility. It's quite a big, interesting topic, so probably actually look it up. But it's particularly interesting when we think about embodiment inside VR. So in his book, where he discusses his early forays in VR, Jaron Lanier talks about the process of making avatars to go inside VR worlds, and how occasionally these designs went really wrong. So accidentally programming bodies with extra limbs or really massive limbs or stuff like that, and that mostly these were unusable. But occasionally they found a body that users could quite easily kind of operate, despite them bearing very little relationship to their own bodies or even realistic bodies. And he also discusses the potential for other body parts, like the tongue, for example. Because of its dexterity, it might actually be a better way of moving or controlling a virtual experience, rather than maybe the traditional ideas of moving through VR using your arms and legs. And what I'm interested in by this is that there's a possibility of expanding our ideas about how bodies could look inside VR and how they could be controlled. And this can really radically change our relationship to concepts like disability inside VR. So moving on from bodies to talk about space now, even though we know that those two are intertwined, because we spoke about that earlier, but I just wanted to really quickly flick through some concepts about architecture and behavior, culture and bodies. So this is an image of Bentham's Panopticon, a prison that was designed to alter prisoners' perception of the extent to which they're being observed, and by virtue of that, altering or controlling their behavior. So see Foucault for more on this. Phrases like locker room chat or water cooler talk and others can indicate that some architectural situations and structures sort of engender a certain kind of behavior. So we might say that locker room chat is maybe typified by a kind of masculine bravado, for example. Hostile architecture, like these so-called anti-homelessness spikes, are placed not only to control certain behaviors, like public resting in doorways or on benches, but they also serve the function to bar certain members of a society from public space. So they don't intend to disappear societal problems, the societal problem of homelessness. They merely disappear it from public view and deny people who are experiencing homelessness access to space. Spaces of segregation, particularly ones that you don't choose but that are given, require persons to identify themselves as one group or another, and ultimately serve to falsely imply these concrete lines of division between groups. Moreover, they facilitate a kind of public enforcement or self-policing of these concepts themselves. So I'm using here an image of a male, female, and disabled toilet sign to illustrate this point. And that finally, objects in space can indicate the acceptance of certain kind of historical perspectives. In this example, the image of the Colston statue as representing a philanthropist rather than a human trafficker and a murderer. And if you're interested in any of these ideas, I recommend the Funambulist magazine, also in the links, which is a magazine run by architects and activists talking about the politics, the relationship between architecture, space, bodies, and politics. What's really interesting when we think about architecture in its most traditional fundamental form is how we can think about this ideal user. So this book, Building Access, by Amy Hammery, is really amazing for loads of reasons. I really recommend reading it. But what I think this book makes crystal clear is that in the process of building a space, in this case, she's talking about building as an architecture, but the same could be true for VR. In the process of building a space, the designer has envisaged a user, and that user's that in that process, the designer has made assumptions about that user's body. So how big it is, how it moves, how strong it is, how many limbs it has, and even maybe what it intends to do in the space. And in the process of making these assumptions about abilities of bodies within the spatial design, the designer actually creates disabilities in users who don't match up to the abilities of the ideal user. And then beyond this, she illustrates really clearly how these ideal users are not even just based on average citizens or median abilities. They're actually based usually on idealized images that kind of relate to like Greek sculptures, so not even relating to real people at all. And more insidiously, that they relate to ideas about the most productive environments for workers. And also they design out less desirable or less productive bodies as a method of control. So just a further note here as well on the inaccessible design of headsets themselves, which I'm aware is a problem. Like they are designed for the hair type, head shape, focal distance, and other factors pretty much of a Caucasian male. And I've linked in the notes a really good article on this. Missed my notes, by Murray and Sixsmith here. So finally, let's look at coding and interaction. So Second Life is a massively multiplayer online world game where there's no game aims, it's just social space. But unlike social media, you're not supposed to be there as yourself, you're kind of there as a fantasticalized version of yourself. And everything created in Second Life, from the environments to the avatar bodies, is sort of made by the users themselves. Gender swapping is that it also extends to like the movements of the bodies as well. So we can see these little characters dancing. People buy different movements that their characters can do. I'm going to skip over this, but this is a really interesting book that talks about the implications of gender swapping inside spaces like Second Life. Essentially, if you can pretend to be a male and perform masculinity through your male avatar, like what is masculinity apart from a performance in the game and in real life? But Second Life is really interesting when we think about how these like queer possibilities of these spaces are kind of coded out. So Alicia Courts writes about Second Life really wonderfully, and she talks about how the sex attributes of the bodies that we choose when we enter the space, so male or female, become the signals for the gender that we're presenting in that space, which obviously kind of undoes a lot of like feminist and critical queer work. But also, as you move through Second Life and interact with objects are also coded with like gendered behavior. So depending on the sex of your avatar, you sit on a chair in a female or a male way. And so despite the ability to gender swap between real life and Second Life, that there's this kind of weighted binary and gendered behavior. So this is a kind of, as I was saying before, a position that you can buy for your avatars to perform. And as we can see, the positions are really clearly labeled male and female inside this KISS. And Courts goes on to talk about the introduction of non-human bodies inside Second Life to kind of avoid this problem where users had to gender themselves and gender themselves based on sex attributes. But she talks about hippo. I've got this image of a little raptor. But you still have the problem of the body still has to interact with objects in a gendered way. And actually the non-human avatars are built around human avatars. So we can see there's a little kind of bubble human body underneath this avatar of a velociraptor skeleton. And in this way, we can see that semiotically and literally the concept of the gender neutral character comes after a gendered body. And because so much of spaces and objects in Second Life predate these non-human avatars, these avatars don't even interact very well with objects like chairs. So not only do they have to sit on chairs in a gendered way, but they also end up sort of sitting through chairs, and there's clipping between them. And that just meant that people didn't use these avatars as much. And so this is like a really clear example of the way that you code a space kind of engender certain behavior inside that space, and even subversive spaces like Second Life can also like continue these deeply ingrained cultural practices. And then I'm going to really quickly script through this, but this is just a funny picture when Facebook spaces were advertising themselves. I find it funny. This article by Michelle Cortez and Andrea Zeller is really interesting. They're two designers at Facebook, and they wanted to intervene in the well-established culture of like making women or female-presenting people feel uncomfortable inside multi-user VR chat spaces, or the Facebook multi-user VR chat space specifically. They talk about how women were experiencing kind of being touched without their consent, kissed, and asked about their real bodies. And as we know from the discussion earlier, like what happens to your virtual body can have a real visceral impact emotionally to the user, just as if it was your real body. And I find this project really interesting because it starts off pretty radical, but then loses its way a little bit. So they basically divided the zones of the VR space into different zones based on how you might experience them in the real world. So you have an intimate space where you would let people maybe engage in touch with you, but in this context, it kind of, or in the social media context, maybe that's your friends or your mutual followers or whatever. They decided to look at real world examples of consent practices and then kind of model these different zones based on those. So in this most intimate zone, they looked to BDSM practices of consent, of gaining consent. And that basically looks like that's based on the understanding that BDSM, when practiced like properly, is one of the safest and most vigorous kind of consent practices available in the world, perhaps. And how it looks is that you and the other user that you're going to invite into this intimate zone will have compiled a checklist of yes, no, and possibilities of physical interaction, and you'll only be able to perform the ones where you both match up. So I think this is really interesting. It's a pretty radical place to look for these new practices of consent. But as they move out in zones, they kind of get a little bit less interesting and a little bit more problematic for me. So by the time they're looking at the wider kind of public zone, and also the one inside that, which is maybe like a social zone, they're looking at the legal practices of consent, which we know kind of don't best serve like victims of sexual assault or survivors of sexual assault. And then they look at just straight up laws as ways to govern people's behavior. And as we've talked about already, like laws are not applied evenly. They are ultimately really harmful as they're practiced in the real world currently. And so just to conclude, for what's next for my project, I wanted to look back at this queer house party, the Zoom event that started in lockdown. So Queer House Party, it was a Zoom party set up by DJs in London who wanted to kind of fill the void left by queer club spaces in the lives of quarantined queers. And this group understood that more than just like a night out, perhaps these spaces offer important and validating parts of queer people's of the lives of queer people. And queer nights are usually typified by quite strict rules of conduct and safe space policy, and these allow people to be free to express their gender and sexuality however they wish without the fear of policing that they might experience in the real world. And Queer House Party was an interesting example of how they took these rules of of conduct and kind of translated them into the structures of this video chat setting. And so my project is hoping to work in a similar way. So I really want to talk to spaces, centers like community spaces, activist groups who work in this way, who develop ways to protect and encourage their users. And that by having in-depth conversation with these groups, I might be able, or together we might be able to like envisage a virtual space that performs these same functions and works towards the same ends of making their users feel safe, accepted, expressing a part of themselves that they can't in maybe traditional public spaces. And then that's my last picture, but I'm probably not going to talk about it because I don't have time. So there we go.
Thanks, Tessa. That was fantastic. And feel free to. I'm a fan of Voyager, so feel free to talk at length if you want to.
Well, I just think it's funny because this image says so much about like imagining who is gonna look at this image, and also what it's supposed to say about Earth. So for those who don't know, this is an image that was sent into space by NASA for like aliens to get and sort of know more about Earth. And it has these like abstract things, and those indicate like where Earth is in the solar system. And then it has a picture of like a white man and a white woman, and they're obviously supposed to indicate like that there's whatever two sexes that exist on Earth, but also like he's really coming forward and waving, she's like stood back, so it's got loads of like stuff about gender in there as well. And then obviously these people just aren't representative of the majority of Earth. So yeah, I find it a particularly, wild image.
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, we could have a very long conversation about that image. Fantastic talk. We're going to get some questions in. If you've got a question you want to ask Tessa, please drop it in the chat. I'm going to kick things off. So there's a difference in the sort of level of embodiment experienced by different people in VR, both varying from person to person and also like with the quality of the hardware available. So if you're using a fancy expensive headset, you're going to be having a much better experience than if you're not. And if you're as you said, if the equipment fits you and if it works for you, you will have that. But how does, in terms of these levels of consent and things, if some people are experiencing this as almost like a real world and some people are experiencing this as moving around a character in a video game, how does that axis of variation feed into a lot of these?
Well, so one thing I've definitely noticed, especially like in a documentary context, so not so much a social VR context, but maybe like a VR experience where, for example, you might meet a historical character, like there is one where you meet a Holocaust survivor and they kind of tell an account of their experience, and I've heard some people, and not to generalize too much, but these do tend to be men who maybe play a lot of games, are really used to these ideas of like embodying a character, that whatever you do with the body in those spaces like Grand Theft Auto or whatever, it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean anything. Saying like, oh, how do we make sure that people don't like put their hand through the Holocaust survivor's face, or like, all these things that's like kind of indicates to me that they're not used to actually having their body very controlled in space. And so I think it's like that most VR is made from that mindset, and for that mindset means that there do have to be, like, for example, the kind of bubble techniques that Facebook are using where you kind of rebuff people that's because those spaces are born out of this culture of like, I can do anything, and having a really entitled idea about what it's like to be in space. So I think even just making a social VR from a different perspective, one that isn't so entitled, would even change the way that people like behave in spaces. So I don't know if that really answered the question, but I just think there is quite a disparity in like who feels entitled to a load of interaction in space, and how actually a lot or the majority of people feel.
I guess this speaks to sort of a distinction between the social norms of a virtual space and what end up being sort of laws of nature in a virtual space. So I know like Facebook have this thing where if people get too close to you, they just fade out. And that's sort of becomes a law of the physics of the universe rather than a social norm, like you don't get too close to people because that's rude.
Mm. And definitely there's loads of stuff written about like the relationship between Second Life and VR chat spaces, and then like just early like computer pioneer type text-based chat spaces. So there's a lot of like sort of like masculine exclusionary behavior that's even just coded into like being online together with other people. Yeah.
I guess you have this phenomenon where there's sort of the mainstream VR spaces like VR chat and Altspace and all these like large corporate spaces, which are very much focused on, as you say, this ideal user and this white man with a goatee. And then you have sort of more experimental spaces where things are maybe more interesting. How do we make sure that we're not just replicating the real world structures where the white men get to have the mainstream and everyone else gets to live on the fringes?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's probably a bigger
Short of dismantling capitalism, how do we do that?
I think it's supposed to be capitalism, probably. But I do think there's also like something to be said about those smaller kind of spaces, and that working in smaller spaces allows like you to import kind of different rules of being together. So one of the things, like a group that I'm really interested in talking to, are people who are working in restorative justice practices. And so that requires a like small dedicated group of kind of moderators of a space. And usually these are like real world spaces. So like I'm thinking specifically of kind of small DIY music scenes. And these kind of nominated moderators are put in place to not just, it's a kind of practice that's the opposite of prisoning or policing. So rather than labeling someone's behavior as bad and therefore they're a bad person and should be ejected from a space, what's a kind of process that can be put in place to make sure that that person accounts for the harm that they've committed, and also addresses the needs of the kind of harmed, basically. And just like you're saying about the I guess what I'm really interested in is how can processes like that, like restorative justice, become the kind of laws of nature of a like VR space? Like, can that be done? I don't know. I probably don't actually have the technical skills to do it, but I'm can draw it maybe in 3. That's the plan.
Yes. Distinction. Restorative justice. Are properly, truly members of the right by. Both of those want different. Either is necessarily more.
Mm-hmm. I think like probably something like Queer House Pie as well is a really interesting example of that. Like it is a public event, anybody could join, but the way they message the kind of safe space rules of the event kind of dictate who or hopefully dictate like who realizes that they are able to come, who should be coming and why they're coming, that kind of thing, and who that space is for. So anyone can come, but you have to kind of have an acknowledgement that then perhaps this space isn't for you, and therefore you have a different relationship to it.
Hear me now?
I can hear you.
So I feel like you could have heard me all along. Okay, great, we're back. Yeah, any more questions from the chat? Then can I think this speaks to another thing, which is liability of the technology and how that feeds into things. So that and especially that as a sort of as an axis of privilege, that the people who often have the good equipment that works all the time and that fits their body are men, and the people are, well, white able-bodied men with rich jobs in Silicon Valley, and the people who are approaching this sort of from another perspective often are making do.
And Sixsmith article is really interesting because kind of there are some like non-negotiable inaccessible qualities of the technology itself, and you know, I'm not going to be able to really you know, that's something that I have to work within, but I do think there is a bit more like, yes, the top range headsets and computers are really expensive, but there are kind of accessible, so like generally financially accessible versions, especially if we think about like smartphone technology. You've got stuff that works about is about the same price point as like high end like phones and stuff. But there is a relationship between what material exists inside that technology and then who purchases the quality material to do it. And it's a bit chicken and egg. Like, yes, at the moment, not many, like there's not this widespread take up of the headsets, and you could say that's because the headsets are yes, inaccessible, but financially inaccessible. But it's also because once you get one, there's not that much in there for you. So I guess I can't tackle the first problem, but I can tackle the second problem, which is like making content that's actually for other demographics.
That's great. I guess that sort of leads on to a final question, which is there any content that you would recommend for people who are interested in VR beyond the scope of the corporate?
Yeah. Well, so not much social VR as far as I know. There are some social VR that sound really interesting that I haven't done, like the Underpresents, stuff like that, which sound really cool. I haven't done them, but I've heard people talk about them, kind of like multi-user theatre things that have come up in lockdown. But just general VR, something I talk about a lot is this project called Neurospeculative Afro Feminism, which is a really great example of a VR project that was designed around and for Black women and women of color, and by Black women and women of color. And not only is it kind of just a really interesting Afrofutures vision of the future that's really beautiful, it's also has this secondary aspect, the kind of neurospeculative aspect. They were thinking about how seeing images in VR of Black women presented as like neurologists or scientists in the future, and how that actually can have a positive, so beyond just being a safe space for women of color, it's actually an enlivening space, or a space, an affirming space, and whether that there's like psychological benefits to going into that space. So I think that's a really interesting project. Yeah, that's one I reference a lot.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been phenomenal. And yeah, there'll be some contact details for Tessa off will appear at the end. Also, if you look down there in the description, you'll see a reading list with plenty of stuff to get your teeth into. So please remember, next week's talk is Data Nature. It's a panel discussion about how data can explore the behaviors and phenomena found in the natural world and how that can lead to processes that are wildly different to conventional big data crunching algorithms. And that's all courtesy of the Southwest Creative Technology Network. You can get the news on all of our future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Don't also forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. And please do share the link. It'll be available to watch again here pretty much immediately. If you have an idea for your own lunchtime talk, we're always looking for new perspectives, new ideas. Drop us a line. Let us know what you want to talk about. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you.